Hi, I'm Wang with Constellation Research. I'm here today with Tom Canning. He's the Vice President of Strategy at Flexera. We're going to talk a little bit about what is going on in the software business and the software supply chain. So real quick, let's think about the business. We are $350 billion in the enterprise software space, $1 trillion if you count embedded devices and IoT. We're heading to $15 trillion by 2020. This is a massive market, massive opportunity, but what has to change when we reimagine what's going on with the software supply chain today?
Well, I think the way we've been thinking about it is almost people don't think about software as a supply chain even today, right? So as we think about industry at large, you look at automotive, retail, really any other major industry, they have long-standing, established, well-controlled supply chains. And yet software really isn't thought of that way. I think
it doesn't even fit in there.
No, there's very few people who think about software and supply chain within the same sentence, right? But I think as you look at, and I think that really comes from maturity, right? So software as an industry is growing very quickly. You mentioned the whole Internet of Things phenomenon really being another huge growth curve. And I think that's driving change, right? People are looking at those kind of things and saying, these sort of standards, policies, things like that apply to other supply chains, the software industry has to start to adhere to some of these things.
That's a really good point. We're talking about digital assets and digital goods. I mean, companies are moving from selling products to selling services through subscriptions. In some cases, those subscriptions are creating new insights, and in some cases, those are creating new experiences and outcomes.
Yep.
And people are actually paying for these, and they're not sure how to monetize that. So what do people have to do to get started to rethink about how software is sold or how things are embedded into devices?
So I think it starts with thinking about it as an end-to-end process, right? And I think the two words that very rarely come into people's vocabulary when you think about the producers of software and the consumers of software is trust and transparency. It's an industry that's built on very little sharing of collaborative information between those that are creating the products and those that are consuming the products. And to your point, when you look at digital services, you look at Internet of Things, people are bringing together more and more different products, different components. Open source is growing considerably in the market. So the complexity is increasing more and more, which drives the need. If you're really going to manage this efficiently and effectively, trust and transparency have to come into the equation. This whole idea of almost combative, audit-based relationships, it just can't continue.
Right, the era of combative audit relationships has to come to an end. And what's really interesting thing, I think it was about 5 weeks ago, I was at a conference. These big appliance makers were thinking about putting a chip in their toaster oven. And the idea was that, their biggest problem was people don't have a register for a toaster.
Yep.
Right, and by the time you get the warranty card, the first customer experience you get is like, oh, my toaster's broken, I'm really mad at you. But imagine if you could change the experience, and if you got the toaster and you actually could log in and register for a new feature, just a new feature, just to get started, that you didn't have without logging in and registering, you got a whole different business model.
Yep.
Right? You can completely transform how you look at software and services. And one of the interesting things about that was the fact that once you have that in place, you can do interesting things. You can create subscription models that you didn't have before. Right? Not just with the software, but also with digital assets and what's happening on the IoT side.
Yeah, and I think that the key thing for me as you talk through that, you asked the question before, what has to change? What's really powering that transformation? And it's data. It's a common shared set of data that's accurate, reliable, and everybody looks at the same way, right? Because if in reality you're going to look at additional features, whatever it might be, or you're going to talk about this trust and transparency across a supply chain, the one thing that you need is a common set of data. And the example that we use is electricity. Right? Electricity is a lot like software. You can't touch it, you can't feel it, you can't see it, but it powers everything in your home. It's there. It's without it, nothing works. In most industries, software is the same these days. So you look at that and you think, okay, what's the one thing that's different with the electricity industry? There's a meter. There's something on the outside of the house. You get a bill once a month. You don't really question it unless it's suddenly 4, 5, 10 times what you would expect it to be. You pay the bill. You assume that in your relationship with your electricity supplier in your home, it's being monitored. You don't need to worry about how your light bulbs are using power versus the TV versus one bedroom versus the kitchen versus another room. That doesn't really enter into anybody's equation. There's a standard measure of electricity consumption, which you can't see. It's a subscription to a service that's powering all the devices in your home. And I think it's a very, very interesting analogy for software, but that's where there's trust and transparency. That's where there's a truly managed supply chain, whereas software, it's the Wild West today.
No, great point. I mean, you get kilowatts per hour, you get different tiering metrics, you get different time of use requirements, all built into something as simple as that. We're here with Tom Canning, Vice President of Strategy at Flexera, talking about how software can be transparent, authentic, and ambient in the background. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.